Chapter 2. Gaius awoke with a splitting headache. Once again he had fallen asleep at his workbench, his magnifying glass goggles strapped tightly to his face. He tried taking them off, but the strap got caught on one of his horns. Again. He cursed and tugged harder until the goggles came free. He tossed them onto the workbench, landing them right next to the large kettle of tea that had long gone cold. Then he pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. What time is it? He looked out the dust-covered windows and saw it was still dark. Judging by how crescented the moon was, however, sunbreak couldn't be too far off. "Stars above," he grunted as he forced himself to stand from his chair. Having slept in such an odd position, he found his body ached like a 70-year-old man, even though he was barely 17. It didn't help that his suspender buckles had dug into his sides as he slept. He stretched and yawned, which seemed to help, though his head still throbbed. He rubbed his eyes again and looked around at his makeshift workshop. It was an old abandoned warehouse on the west underside, which was perfect for all the heavy machinery he needed for his business, and it also came with a great view of the sea. Pulleys and tracks ran along the ceiling. Iron circular stairs wound up to catwalks along the walls, and every conceivable tool he could think of hung proudly on his wall. It even had a little room in the back with a proper bed that he should definitely use more often. He called the warehouse the Lab, and he loved it. He had acquired it a couple years ago in a card game on the lower east side of Portunus. Obviously, he had cheated. Luck didn't make its way into Gaius' life often, and when it did, it was usually bad. Luck of the bad variety got his father injured and fired from the mines. Luck of the unfortunate variety got his mother sick. And luck of the mortally worst kind had landed him as being born a Dowler, a freak race with light blue skin and black spiraling horns. But none of that mattered here in the lab, nor did it matter to his customers. As long as they got their shipment on time and intact, Gaius could have been a unicorn for all they cared. And thanks to staying up all night to finish things up, the shipment was indeed on time and intact. Barely. He was particularly proud of this last batch. Wood stock and wood pistol grip in the front, 22 caliber 3-round burst clockwork rifles. The 3-round burst was his idea. He called these little beauties the Q3 rifle series. Knowing the value of information, especially in weapons technologies, he made each of these 150 rifles by hand. And as far as he knew, he was the only person in the world with this kind of weaponry. Him, and in about an hour, the Gabion gang. "Lord Q!" yelled a voice from the door to the warehouse. Stars, they're early, Gaius thought as he scrambled to get ready. Thankfully, between him and the voice, there was a large stack of wooden crates full of Q3 rifles, blocking anyone's view of him as they came in the main doors of the lab. A black doomstorm mask in the shape of a ram sat on his desk. He quickly picked it up and put it on. It wasn't the full set, but it would have to do for now. His own black horns fitted nicely into the half-circular grooves on the mask, making them look like they were always part of it and not growing out of his head. "We're here to collect our shipment," yelled the voice again. "And I'm here to collect the deed and the manifest," said Gaius from behind the crates. He had learned long ago that the less information you gave away, including your position, your face, your name, the better. He didn't trust the Gabion gang, and they didn't trust him, both for good reason. But for now they needed each other, and so went the world of the black market in Portunus, mutual distrust and mutual dependence. "Excellent," laughed the voice. "You come out here, take a look at these documents, make sure everything's in order, and we'll take our shipment and be on our merry way. No one gets hurt, no one dies. A starry good day, if you ask me." Without saying a word, Gaius picked up the Q3 rifle from the workbench in front of him and stepped out from behind the crates. He immediately trained the rifle on Zalin, the man behind the voice, making sure he knew who was in charge of the exchange. Zalin was a small man with a Weasley look about him, probably because he was a Weasley person. Gaius couldn't stand Zalin, and that's who Keystone always sent as his representative to deal with Gaius. And so it gave Gaius great pleasure to aim a gun at the weasel, who today was sporting a brown leather overcoat that covered up his dark wool trousers and vest. He appeared unarmed, which was quite a surprise to Gaius. Zalin, who was holding some documents in one of his hands, immediately put his hands up in the air. "Whoa there, little buddy," he said with a light-hearted grin on his face. "Easy does it. Don't shoot the messenger, I always say. I'm just here on Keystone's behalf. Besides," he paused as 20 armed men came bustling into the lab. I don't think you're in a position to threaten me, but we're definitely in a position to threaten you." The armed men all wore thick wool overcoats and bowler hats, and each was armed with a rifle and sidearm as well. Some even had the glint of knives on their persons. The first 10 took up position on either side of Zalin, aiming their rifles right at Gaius. The other 10 began climbing the circular wrought iron stairs up to the catwalk on the sides of the lab, taking their positions above Gaius. Zalin slowly lowered his hands, reached inside his coat pocket and brought out a silver cigarette case and a matchbook. He carefully lit the cigarette and breathed out a satisfying stream of smoke. "Here's the new deal, Lord Q," he said calmly. "We take the shipment, and in exchange we give you your life. And as a sign of your cooperation in this new venture, I'd ask that you lower your beautiful clockwork rifle and place it on the crate right next to you." Gaius did as instructed. Slowly, he lowered the rifle with one hand, held up the other hand in surrender as he deliberately moved toward the closest crate, carefully placing the rifle on top. Then from behind the crate, he slowly pulled out a wire detonator, holding it directly in front of him to deter any thought of shooting him. Zalin didn't look as confident all of a sudden. "Hold your fire," he roared at his subordinates. He growled as he threw his cigarette to the ground and put it out with the toe of his shoe. "Explosives?" he asked. Gaius nodded. "In the walls?" Gaius nodded again. "What do you want?" Gaius smiled behind his mask. "The original agreement," he said. "That's it?" asked Zalin. "That's it," said Gaius. "And I want out." Zalin looked confused. "Out? Out of what? The lab?" "He means out of the Gabions," said a deep, melodious voice from behind Zalin. Zalin spun around, revealing a rather large man in a white overcoat with white trousers, a black vest, and a white top hat which he removed as he stepped into the lab. He sported a very long ebony cane with a silver hammerhead on top. Black sideburns ran down his face, contrasting sharply with his pale white features. His jaw was square and tough as granite. Keystone cut an imposing figure and made it clear to all who was the chief boss of the Gabions. "Lord Keystone," said Gaius, "welcome to my humble abode. It's been a while since you've graced us with your presence. To what do we owe the pleasure?" "So that's the grand plan, is it?" said Keystone, completely ignoring Gaius's welcome. He continued walking slowly toward Gaius as he spoke. "The mysterious Lord of Questions wants to go topside, wants to be a respectable citizen again, wants to be clean." "Wants to be free," added Gaius. "Free," mused Keystone as he took another hesitant step, eyeing the detonator. "Freedom. The greatest lie of them all. The truth is we are all slaves, Lord Q. Even I, the head of the great Gabion crime syndicate, is bound in chains to the system. The only freedom we enjoy in life is in choosing to whom or to what we're enslaved." Keystone took yet another step, which was one step too many in Gaius's eyes. He held up his detonator, warning Keystone to get no closer. Keystone got the message and stopped dead in his tracks. But he was close enough to speak softly so as no one except Gaius could hear him. He leaned forward, the cane bearing the brunt of his massive weight. "Enough of this, Gaius," said Keystone in a low, hardly audible voice. What? How did he know his name? Hadn't he taken every precaution to only use the name Lord Q in his dealings with the Gabion gang, and wore a mask at every encounter to hide his face? Hadn't he taken a different route home every day so as to not be followed? Hadn't he done everything in his power to keep that information safe, to keep his family safe? Then how? How did he know? "Gaius, I am a crime lord," Keystone explained mundanely, as if reading his mind. "I have armies of men and women whose only task is to gather information about the people with whom I do business. It's bad business not to know. Information is power. So of course I know who you are. I know who your family is. I know you are no lord or noble. But most importantly of all, I know just how valuable you are to me. You've got guts, kid, and brains. Not too many of my boys can claim both, believe you me. So please try to understand my position. I can't just give you the deeds to an airship and the manifest of its crew for you to skip town without first making it perfectly clear that you are not free. You are mine." At those words, Gaius's heart sank. He had hoped, perhaps against reason, that if he could just complete this one last task he could leave. Every deal he made with the Gabians, he knew he was putting himself and his family at risk. But what choice did he have? With his father injured, his mother sick, and he being the oldest, there were 10 mouths to feed in their family. They needed the money. It was far more than he could have possibly made working in the mines. But one deal led to another, and another. Before Gaius knew it, he was sunk. And only now was he beginning to realize how deep into the pit he had fallen. "I own you," whispered Keystone. "I keep your family safe. Because without me backing you, well, I couldn't guarantee their safety anymore. And I'd hate for you to leave town only to receive word that something terrible happened to your entire family while you were away. To Georg, Marie, Jest, Kine, Lona, Sarti, Hora, Tybalt, and little Pepper. What a shame." Gaius clenched his teeth in rage. He dared use his family as leverage against him? By name? Thank Da for the mask. His hand trembled on the detonator, itching to slam it home, ending the Gabians in one single exultant blow, ending this monster with just a single flick of his wrist. But reason stayed his hand. Surely he could outthink this megalomaniac. Surely he could figure out a plan to get rid of this cancer upon society and upon his family. Perhaps not here, perhaps not today, but someday he would be free, him and his entire family. Keystone waited for a reply, but seeing that none was coming, he continued in his usual loud, deep voice. "I have a proposition, Lord Q. Obviously you had plans abroad, hence the airship and the crew. I respect that. You've worked hard and you deserve some well-earned rest. Take a vacation, see the world. But in 3 months, I want to see you back here working on your next brilliant invention. You hear me? Gabian needs you. I need you. And whether they know it or not, Portunus needs you. So what do you say?" Keystone extended a hand for a handshake, a toothy grin filling his head. "I still want the deed and the manifest," Gaius said. Keystone scowled. "You want the deed and the... Fine, I see. You want to feel you own something of your own, is that it? Again, I respect that." Without turning his head, he yelled, "Zallen!" To which Zallen squeaked and came running up beside the boss. "Give young Master Q the deed and the manifest, as promised." Zallen hastily extended the manifest and the deed toward Gaius. Gaius, not wanting to let go of the detonator for even a second, motioned for him to set it on the floor. He did so and backed away. 3 months, repeated Keystone in a whisper. "After that I can no longer guarantee the protection of your family." "Am I free to go?" asked Gaius flatly. "I already told you. None of us are free," replied Keystone with a shrug. "But you have my word. You will not be harmed as you depart. Like I said before, your mind is far too valuable to be wasted by a bullet." Mutual distrust, mutual dependence. "By the way," bellowed Keystone as he reached into his coat and pulled out some vials filled with violet ink. He placed them on the floor next to the papers. "That's for your family. It's not dragon blood, but violet ink should fetch a hefty sum to feed your family while you're away. Compliments to the Gabian family." Gaius calmly set the detonator down and stooped down to pick up the deed and the manifest. He purposefully ignored the gift of inks as he stood and walked away. Keystone laughed. "Suit yourself," he yelled after him. He bent over and retrieved the inks, placing them back in his coat pocket. But never say that Keystone never lent a helping hand to those less fortunate than himself. Keystone turned to his 21 men and started yelling orders for them to start collecting the boxes of Q3 rifles to transport back to their base. Gaius collected the few things he needed for his trip in a bag and walked out a hidden side door. It always caught him off guard being in the underside. Top side of Portunus was easy. It was literally the top side of the 45-mile-long, 15-mile-wide bridge that was Portunus. At the center, the bridge stood 500 feet above the sea below, granting amazing views in either direction all the way to the horizon. The Bridge City, as it was known, connected the northern and southern continents on top, as well as the 2 seas down below, making it the most powerful trading empire in the world, even though it was only a single city-state located on a massive bridge. Topside was where the powerful and wealthy lived and worked and died. It was where all the museums, operas, mansions, parks, theaters, music halls, and fine restaurants were located. It was also where the Council Dome was located, housing the political power of Portunus. Anything that spoke of leisure or luxury or power would be found there, including the people wielding them. Lower Portunus, on the other hand, was where the powerless and the poor lived and worked and died. For the most part, the ghettos and shacks of the lowers were built on the stone bases of each massive pillar that rose hundreds of feet in the air to support the bridge above. In between these bases stood the water that connected the seas to the east and west, making this area perfect for various ports and docks to welcome incoming merchant vessels to unload their wares. It also meant that each base was its own island, often forming their own tight-knit communities that rarely ventured beyond their own little world. Some of these ghettos even named the stone pillar that dominated their view and supported the world above, as if the pillar itself was their god and would grant them favor or justice. But the bridge above paid these ghettos no mind and did them no favors, sending down no food or medicine or aid. Only its long shadow, casting the entire area in perpetual twilight, made its way from topside to lower. And it was awful. Everything smelled of fish and death. Poverty roamed the streets like a disease, claiming its victims just as easily. Desperation seemed to linger on the air. The very thought of going topside seemed a fantasy akin to going to Da's own bosom. It was like hearing a fairy tale story for children, a thing of make-believe that could never be their reality. Too many died having lived their entire life in the shadow of paradise and never even catching a glimpse of it. Gaius knew this all too well. The Dalar ghetto was in the lowers, and it was to the lowers that Gaius would be heading tonight. But the underside was somewheres in between. It consisted of buildings and platforms that were hanging down from the giant stone archways that supported topside, primarily warehouses, taverns, and industries. The winds that came in off the sea would often rock the suspended buildings and platforms of underside, making it ideal for taverns of sea-legged sailors not yet ready to feel the solidness of land again. This was where those who were respected but still poor lived and worked and died. But because underside was built from the ceiling down, everything was suspended over a massive drop. Hundreds of feet separated you from the water below. To fall from here was certain death, which some took as a blessing. To get from topside to underside was fairly easy. Wrought iron or stone stairs often ran from one section to another. The real trick was knowing where the closest set of stairs stood. To get from underside to lower, stairs were available, but hardly ever used. Instead, giant lifts had been created to transport goods and people from the merchant vessels below to the shops and taverns above. Giant steam engines powered the lifts, making coal a valuable commodity in the bridge city. And there was no direct way to get from lower to topside. As Gaius stepped onto the narrow platform outside the lab, a brutally clever idea popped in his head. He walked up the closest stone stairs leading to topside and found the nearest policeman he could see. Then he walked up to said policeman and placed a vial of yellow ink in his hand. Then he whispered his plan in the policeman's ear, to which the policeman nodded in agreement, accepting the bribe. With that, Gaius quickly stripped himself of all his clothing and raced down the same stone stairs he had just walked up. The policeman, following the instructions of the bribe, promptly gave chase. "Stars above, get back here!" yelled the policeman. "Never!" yelled Gaius, laughing. He thought he would have to fake the laughter, but he found it actually came quite naturally given the very odd circumstances he had purposefully created. Round the corner they ran, he slowing down just a bit to let the slightly overweight policeman keep up. Just up ahead he saw Keystone, Zalin, and his other minions walking away from the lab, the minions carting away the crates of Q3 rifles. Perfect, thought Gaius as he increased his speed. He ran right at Keystone, making sure to bump into him with just enough effort to make it convincing, but not enough to completely bowl him over onto the platform. Spinning off of Keystone, Gaius pushed his way through the rest of the gang and jumped off the platform where he knew another was just below. He then took off back toward the stone stairs where his clothes still lay. The policeman quickly came to a halt next to Keystone, very out of breath and very sweaty. "My apologies, Lord Keystone," gasped the policeman. "If I had known you were down this platform, I would have done my best to keep that hooligan out of your way and off your person." He paused to catch his breath. "Is there anything I can do for you, sir?" he resumed, gasping for air. "Who was that Dalar boy?" asked Keystone. "Is he one of mine?" "Stars, I doubt it," said the policeman. "Just a troublemaker like the rest of 'em. Caught him terrorizing the topside nobles with his lack of proper attire." He paused to get his breath and wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. But at least I managed to scare him away from proper society and back to the underside. No offense intended." "None taken," said Keystone. "And officer?" "Yes?" "I believe you deserve something for your troubles. Courtesy of the Gabian gang. I'm sure you'll remember this kindness in the future should we ever have a favor to ask of you." "It would be my pleasure," said the policeman. But as Keystone reached into his coat pocket to retrieve the vial of violet ink, he found his pocket was empty instead. "Stars above, that little scamp," thought Keystone. "That nude little Dowler stole my violet vials, and he did a clean job of it, too. I didn't even notice until now. I'll have to keep my eyes open for him. Maybe he'd be interested in working for me." "Zallen," Keystone yelled, "pay this fine officer a vial of ink. Yellow will suffice." Zallen handed the policeman the vial of yellow ink, to which the policeman tipped his hat and turned to walk away. Gaius could hardly contain his delight at having stolen the violet vials. True, he could have just taken them with the deed in the manifest when they were offered, but it just seemed wrong to accept a gift from Keystone. Besides, stealing them was so much more rewarding and exhilarating. But Keystone wasn't wrong. These vials would keep his family fed for the better part of the year, let alone the 3 months he'd be gone. More importantly, he had proved that Keystone did not know his face. His name, yes, and his family's, but not their faces. The mask had done its job after all. Knowing what your enemy didn't know was just as valuable as knowing what he did. With those happy thoughts fluttering in his mind, he made his way to his next stop, Flatter's Foundry, a metallurgy mill on the way from the lab to home. Inside the insanely hot foundry, he quickly spotted his fake boss, Mr. Flatter, a tired, fat old blacksmith who had forgotten more about metals and smelting than Gaius would ever learn in his lifetime. Yes, he often came to Mr. Flatter for advice when working with difficult metals like Doomsterl, but every evening on his way home from work, he stopped by in order to keep a protective lie alive for his parents' sake. "Are you here to flatter me, Lord Q?" said Mr. Flatter without even looking up from his newspaper, a thick cigar clenched tightly in his teeth, and pushing aside the even thicker mustache on his face. He used the same tired joke every time Gaius came by, and Gaius always gave the same reply. "My, you're looking thin today, Mr. Flatter, and younger, too." And then Mr. Flatter would give a humph grunt and hold out a hand for payment. Gaius would put the red ink in his hand. Mr. Flatter would hand him an official punch card with his name, fake hours, and fake pay listed out. "Take care, Mr. Flatter," said Gaius as he left. "Good riddance," said Mr. Flatter. They'd been doing the same routine for 4 years now, but for some reason Gaius always looked forward to speaking with Mr. Flatter. With punch card in hand, Gaius now headed to the drugstore to buy his mom's medicine. Doctor's bills were bad enough, but it was the medicine that really hit the vials hard. It cost a single blue vial for a month's worth of medicine. If he really did work for Mr. Flatter and earned his primary income from the foundry, he would get 3 vials of black ink a day with overtime. It would take him 33 days to earn enough for 1 bottle of medicine, and that wouldn't include paying for rent, food, and oil for Light as well. But with his current job working with the black market, it was manageable. Speaking of food, he popped into one of the nicer bakeries on the underside and bought a fresh loaf of bread. He knew his parents would wonder where he got the money for this, but he already had a lie prepared. If nothing else, they wouldn't deny his younger siblings this special treat. With his last errand finally done, he now proceeded to the isolated stairs that led from underside to lower. He made sure to use a different set of stairs every time, selecting them at random to keep from being followed. Most folks took the lifts rather than walking up and down the hundreds of feet of stairs built into some of the stone pillars of Bridge City, but Gaius found these stairs to be such a blessing. Not only could he avoid meeting anyone on his way to and from work, but he also got the added benefit of keeping his legs in great shape. Sitting around in a workshop all day, using primarily his arms and hands, did very little for his thighs and calves. The stairs easily made up the difference. Granted, he always looked forward to descending in the evenings. Most mornings were a grueling uphill climb that he always dreaded. Mornings took the better part of an hour, while evenings were almost half that time. Gaius felt guilty coming home. He knew the lab was far bigger and more comfortable than his parents' shack. He knew that most of his equipment and materials could be sold to buy something much nicer in a better part of town. He knew that the bed he had in the back room of the lab was drastically more comfortable than the hammock waiting for him at home. But he also knew that his family was far safer living in the Dowler ghetto than anywhere farther up, and safety trumped comfort any day. On top of that, Gaius understood business in a way his mother and father never could. It was a proven fact that to make money, you had to spend money. It was such a balancing act, knowing what to give to the family and what to reinvest in the lab to keep a steady revenue from the black market. If he didn't have his warehouse and his equipment and his tools and his mask, he couldn't make a fraction of the money he gave to support his family. At least that's what he told himself every time he arrived at the shack, trying desperately to ease his troubled conscience. "I'm home," he said as he walked through the rusted tin door leading to a single room that housed 10 people, "and I brought bread." Mom, a short thin woman with a kind face and kind eyes, was playing with little Pepper at the dinner table, which took up the center of the room with large benches allowing for more seating than chairs. Thin crutches propped up his thin, injured dad as he stood at the stove cooking, which basically constituted the entirety of the kitchen. The other 3 walls were lined with hammocks for sleeping. A single corner was walled off for the toilet, but they used the kitchen sink for bathing. Privacy was a luxury they could definitely not afford. And that was it, the entire shack. Oh, and Percy. Percy quickly glided down from the exposed rafters above to land on Gaius' shoulder, his brass wings shimmering majestically in the lamplight. He let out a quick succession of chirps that sounded like scissors opening and closing quickly, followed by a short trill. Percy was an old family heirloom that had been handed down for generations, an automaton swallow with onyx black eyes and a doomstrel beak. Such things were incredibly rare and worth a fortune, but no matter how bad things got financially for their family, they would never, ever consider selling Percy. Period. "Stars, where is everyone?" asked Gaius as he sat down next to Mom at the table, placing the loaf of bread in front of him. "Don't change the subject," she said, coughing after the words left her mouth. Gaius instinctively handed his mother the bottle of medicine he had just purchased, knowing full well that her other bottle would be empty. "I'm sorry, what?" asked Gaius, confused. "Your mother and I were just discussing why you didn't come home last night," said Dad, as he stroked his thin black goatee. "We were worried sick. The herd has been out looking for you all day." The herd. That's what his dad called the kids. It was slang from the older generation, probably a play on the sheep-like horns of the Daller. Gaius resented it. "There was no need for that. I was just working overtime for Mr. Flatter. See?" He handed the punch card to his dad, along with 4 vials of black ink, the lowest color. His dad leaned on one of his crutches, took the punch card, and pretended to read it. But Gaius had learned long ago that his dad couldn't read. He kept up the appearance because he wanted his herd to know how important getting a good education was. He quickly handed the card to his mother, who could only read simple words you absolutely needed to know in order to get by, like rent and deadline and foreclosure. "It says here that you were paid 6 bottles of black ink, not 4, she said, feeling proud for having caught the discrepancy. A small cough escaped her lips. 3 for each day. "Don't be mad," started Gaius as he pulled out the 2 vials of violet ink. "But I stopped by Harvey's after work today to try my luck at cards, and I got lucky. 2 bottles of black became 2 bottles of violet. I was also able to buy the bread with some of my winnings." Percy let out a long whistle. Dad nearly fell over from the shock of seeing that color. Mom put a hand to her mouth. "Where did you get those?" asked Dad. "I just told you. I won them in a card game." "Did you steal them?" asked Mom. He hated when they double-teamed him, and he hated that he had to keep lying to them to protect them from the truth of his criminal activity. That would break their hearts more than anything. "No, I did not steal them." It bothered him how easily the lie came. He didn't even have to try anymore. "Tell us the truth, Gaius," said Mom. "Why don't you trust me? Why don't you believe me when I tell you that I got lucky? Is it because our family hasn't had a shred of luck my entire life? Aren't we due? Isn't it our turn?" It broke his heart to lie to them, and it broke his heart to see how much they no longer believed him. Tears welled up in his eyes as he lied to them, but he held them in. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, somehow communicating in secret what the other was thinking without having to say a single word. It was clear they still didn't believe him, but they also were in no mood to argue about it. "All right, son," said Dad. "We trust you. What would a family be if we didn't have trust?" "And love," chimed in Mom. She smiled and placed a hand on Gaius' forearm, but immediately withdrew it as a new bout of coughing took her. She handed little Pepper to Gaius and quickly walked outside in an attempt to save them all from hearing her struggle. Dad turned his attention back to the stew he was making. "I'm sorry," he said, almost to himself. Gaius wasn't expecting that. His father was a proud man and rarely apologized. "For the accusation?" said Gaius. "For making you grow up so fast," he continued, stirring the pot of stew, though it was clearly ready to serve. Gaius knew his father was not an educated man, but he wasn't stupid, and Gaius was beginning to suspect that somehow his father knew everything about him and what he'd been doing. For a split second, he wanted nothing more than to tell him everything, to spill his guts about working with the gangs, selling weapons on the black market, owning the lab, and inventing his own gadgets. In that moment, he wanted to simply be a son who could share his life with his dad. But the moment abruptly passed. The herd had arrived. The door slammed open and a wave of Dallor children came flooding into the one-room shack, talking and screaming and laughing. As soon as they saw Gaius, they all started chiming, "We found him! We found him! We found him!" Percy mimicked their chant with rhythmic chirps, annoying Gaius all the more. But even in his annoyance he couldn't help but grin. He pressed his forehead against each of theirs in turn, their horns clicking slightly as they connected. Then, without any instruction or order, they all took up their places at table, shoulder to shoulder on the wooden benches. Dad placed the pot of stew right in the center and started filling each bowl with stew. Mom walked back in from outside, faking a smile to hide the pain of her cough. She quickly busied herself breaking apart the loaf of bread and handing equal pieces to each of the herd. The whole scene was pure chaos. Then Dad sat down at the end of the table and extended his hands to Gaius and to Jest. Everyone else went completely silent and held hands as well. "Da, author of life, we speak our words of thanks to you. We thank you for words like family, trust, and love. And we thank you for our names. We thank you for the name of Georg, Marie, Gaius, Jest, Kine, Lona, Sarti, Hora, Tybalt, Percy, and Little Pepper. At this meal we thank you for the words bread and stew. May we always speak your words with grace and charity. Period." Period, they all said in unison. But Gaius hesitated. Hearing that list of names did not make him think of a god he no longer believed in. It reminded him of Keystone and filled him with dread. He looked around the dinner table and imagined what would happen should he ever disobey or upset the mob boss. His stomach turned at the thought. "Gaius, are you going to eat your stew?" asked Jest from across the table. Jest was the next oldest behind Gaius, but was already a head taller and still growing. A thin goatee, the same color as Dad, started to sprout from his chin, and his horns were beginning to spiral. He looked at Gaius's stew and bread with longing. "Here," said Gaius, as he passed his bowl and bread. "Gaius," pleaded Mom, "you need to eat." "Marie," said Dad, "I gave that stew to Gaius. It is up to him what he does with it after that." Dad winked at Gaius, again as if he knew more than he was saying. Gaius winked back to say thank you. "Plus," continued Dad, "Jess needs the extra food because it's his turn to feed Percy this evening." As if on cue, Percy flew over to Jess, chirping and trilling excitedly. "Do I have to?" moaned Jest. "You know the rules," said Dad. Setting down his spoon, and with a roll of his eyes, Jest raised his hand toward Percy's beak. With a movement that took less than a millisecond, Percy opened his beak and shot out and retracted a needle-shaped tongue that extracted a few drops of Jess' blood. The move was so quick he hardly felt a thing. With an excited trill and a few chirps for good measure, Percy flew over to Gaius and landed on his shoulder. "Oh, I see how it is," said Jest. "I feed you, but you still prefer Gaius." Gaius rubbed the space just above Percy's beak. Percy leaned into the petting as if he could actually feel it. Gaius squinted at the strange little bird, wondering what beautiful magic or science had crafted him so many eons ago. "You just have to learn how to appreciate him," said Gaius, half to Jest and half to himself. After supper was over, and all the dishes were done and Mom was pulling Pepper to bed, Gaius found himself sitting with Dad and Jest on the steps in front of the shack. It had somehow become a tradition, though Gaius knew not why. Georg pulled out a pipe and thumbed a small pinch of tobacco into it. Gaius knew he would only get a few puffs out of such a small amount of tobacco, but his dad would enjoy those few puffs nonetheless. Percy remained inside as Pepper needed to hold him in order to fall asleep, another tradition that Gaius claimed ignorance as to the origin. "A strong night," said Dad, referring of course to the heavy wind that flowed through the lowers and played with his goatee. The wind carried that familiar fishy stench with it, but for anyone who lived here it was part of being home. Dad's pipe smoke smelled far richer, contrasting the stench with its novelty and sweetness. Dad offered Gaius a puff, and Gaius politely declined with a wave of his hand. "What about me?" asked Jest. Dad shrugged his shoulders. "Why not?" he said. Jest took a small puff, knowing not to inhale into his lungs. He slowly let out a trail of smoke and smiled. Gaius half expected him to cough, but was pleasantly surprised how well he handled himself. Perhaps his little brother was growing up after all. "Dad?" asked Gaius, knowing he couldn't push this conversation off any longer, and yes, it was going to involve more lying. Dad took back his pipe from jest and tilted his head back in invitation for Gaius to continue. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Gaius said, jumping right into the heart of what he needed to say. "The Foundry needs me to travel to Bastille for some advanced training. May take as long as 3 months. I figure those violet vials will see the family through until I can return." "I reckon they will," said Dad, letting out another puff of smoke. "Bastille, eh? The Athalian Empire. Ha! I'm surprised those imps have anything to teach a respectable Portunus man. I'd wager you'll be the one teaching them, son." It always surprised Gaius how loyal his father was to Portunus, the city-state that cared very little for those in the lowers. But the land you're born on leaves a deep mark. Even if you hate it, it's home. And any foreign empire that competes with your home is automatically the enemy. "You should steal one of their books," said Jest. "The kids at work say that they have the most powerful wizards in the world because of their books. Stars, I'd like to see one. A wizard, I mean. They say they can breathe fire like dragons and fly like birds, all because of those magic books. You should steal one and bring it back home and become a powerful wizard too." "They're called wordsmiths, Jest, not wizards," corrected Gaius. "And I can't just steal one." He trailed off. Now that was a thought. As far as he knew, no one in the Gabian gang was a wordsmith. With a powerful Codex in his hand, maybe he could force Keystone to let him go, to let his family go. No more stealing, no more lying. Freedom. But at what cost? "Gaius, you okay, son?" said Dad as he leaned forward from the step. "Yeah, sorry," said Gaius half-heartedly. "Just thinking about getting ready for the trip." "Well, don't get any smart ideas from Jest, you hear?" said Dad. "Those wordsmiths are powerful, not just with magic. They're nobles. They have titles and money and the full weight of the law. And you—" He stopped there, but Gaius completed the thought. "And I'm just a daller." "Exactly," said Dad. "Go to Bastille, do your training, and come back safe and sound. Anything more than that is fool's gold. Promise me you won't do anything stupid." "I promise," said Gaius. "I won't do anything stupid." And this time he wasn't lying. If he was going to steal a Codex, he couldn't afford to be stupid. He'd have to be brilliant. There was just one problem. Dad was right. Wordsmiths were very, very dangerous. And not everyone in Bastille carried a Codex. Only the most wealthy, powerful nobles had that right. Even here in Portunus, the law was clear. Only those with noble blood could own or use a Codex. Hence why Keystone never even dared try to use one. And to steal one would be even worse. Once bound, a Codex could not be unbound until its former master was dead. And Gaius was no murderer. New codices were only made by commission. There were no warehouses full of empty codices waiting for someone to bind to them. Each was handmade with a specific person in mind. Sometimes the noble themselves would make it. More often the church would make it for them. But each would usually only exist for about a year at most before being bound, which meant that there were very, very few unbound codices floating around. Gaius also knew yet another fact that bothered him. It took 3 wordsmiths to bind a new wordsmith to his Codex, and wordsmiths were very, very particular about only binding fellow nobles. If peasants started getting their hands on codices and began binding other peasants to other codices, it could quickly lead to revolution and anarchy, 2 words the nobility hated. But a plan was already beginning to germinate in his mind's eye. A risky plan, a horrible plan, and a costly plan, but a plan nonetheless. Later that night, after everyone was fast asleep and the moon was already halved, Gaius crept out of his hammock. It is a difficult thing to quietly climb out of a cloth hammock, but after a lifetime of sleeping in one and getting out of it every morning, Gaius made quick work of it. His feet landed softly on the rusty metal floor of the shack. Slowly, carefully, he snuck toward Jest. Of course, Jest was not alone. Directly above him was Kine, and below him was Lona. There were other siblings to his left and right. Mom and Dad were on the adjacent wall, Dad softly snoring, as he always did. As Gaius stood by his brother's side, he stared down at the metal bird resting gently on his sleeping chest. This was the hard part. He didn't know how Percy would react to being snatched quickly in the middle of the night. If he chirped loud enough, he would wake the whole family. What's more, Percy never actually slept. Being an automaton, he was always awake, his onyx eyes always watching. "Okay, Percy," whispered Gaius, trying to calm the metal bird. "Let's go for a half-moon flight, eh? Just you and me." Slowly he reached for the bird and placed his hands on either side of it, preventing the wings from unfolding. "What are you doing?" Gaius about jumped out of his skin. He had been so focused on Percy, he didn't even notice that Jest was staring right at him, eyes wide open. He had only spoken a whisper, but it had sounded loud enough to wake the dead. "Stars, Jest!" whispered Gaius, his heart pounding from the shock. "What are you doing with Percy?" Gaius had prepared for this. At supper, I noticed that Percy was limping a bit on his right leg when he perched. I didn't want to worry Mom or Dad, so I thought I'd check it out while they were sleeping. Probably just needs some oil, that's all. "That's a lie," whispered Jest, a little louder than Gaius liked. "You might think you're good at lying, but you're actually quite bad at it, you know. I think Mom and Dad just play along with it because it's easier than always having to call you out on it." "Okay, it's a lie," whispered Gaius. "Time for plan B. The truth is, I'm nervous about leaving home tomorrow. I figured if I brought Percy with me, I'd have someone from home to keep me company. I was going to leave a note for Mom and Dad because I know they'd be furious with me. So what do you say, Jest? Will you cover for me?" "No," he said. "Take me with you." "What?" said Gaius. Said, not whispered. The word was out of his mouth before he realized it. Dad snorted a snore that shook the entire house, or at least that's how it felt to Gaius. After a brief pause, no one woke. "Are you out of your star-loving mind?" hissed Gaius. "I would already be in enough trouble if I took Percy. What do you think will happen when I take the next eldest son?" "You've got to," said Jest. "I'm begging you. I'm more like you than you realize, you know that? I'm not such a huge fan of the lowers either. I know why you stay away some nights working that foundry like there's no tomorrow. And it's not for the money. It's to get away from here. Well, I want out too. And besides, Percy's obedient to me, not you. He had my blood for supper, not yours. You need me to go with you. Otherwise, I'll make Percy screech, stars above, I swear it." Gaius hadn't anticipated this. He dashed through his mind, trying to find another lie, another story, another spin to convince his brother to stay. But every lie rang hollow. Every lie wouldn't work, because he knew exactly how Jess was feeling, and no lie had ever convinced him to stay in the lowers. But perhaps the truth would work. "You can't, Jest," sighed Gaius. "It's too dangerous." "Too dangerous to stay in Bastille while you train for the foundry?" "I'm not going for the foundry, you idiot. I'm going for the Gabion gang. Originally the plan was to move the entire family there to keep you all safe, but Keystone found out I had to change plans. Now I'm going to find another way to keep the family safe, and I need Percy to do that. So yes, it's too dangerous for you to come. I need you to stay here and help Mom and Dad." "Another lie," said Jest. "Screw that." So much for the truth. Jest quickly jumped out of bed, still holding Percy. The little metal swallow cooed softly in his hands. "Jest," whispered Gaius harshly, "you can't come." But Jest just ignored him. Setting Percy on the table in the middle of the shack, Jest quickly found his only pair of pants and began putting them on over his long underwear. He snapped on his suspenders, put on his gray jacket, and popped a faded tan driver hat on his head. He called to Percy, who flew directly onto his shoulder as if by command. "I assume we're leaving now before anyone can stop us," he said. Gaius sighed. "Yeah, I guess we are." And as they walked out the door and up the road to the closest pillar to climb to the topside, Gaius found himself actually relieved and, dare he say, happy that he wouldn't be alone. Not this time.